What's going on, everyone? My name is Mark and welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel for the first time. In today's video, you'll get to watch me 3D print and fully assemble a Tusken Raider helmet from the Star Wars franchise. Unlike any of my other videos, this one was a nice change of pace because all of my helmet builds to date are painted from beginning to end, whereas this particular helmet is one that is wrapped in primarily canvas and leather, with only small painted metallic parts. Also, while I have a moment, I want to provide some insight on what creative direction I'm moving in with my channel. I'll begin by sharing the most exciting of the news first, which is that I have begun 3D printing a life-sized B1 battle droid. Although this was an end-of-the-year goal for 2022, I simply wasn't able to pursue it until now. Beyond that, I've printed Majora's Mask, the Ocarina of Time Spiritual Stones, which ultimately will have resin-cast gem inserts, a Stormtrooper that's in 20 pieces, and currently I am printing a Bo-Katan helmet. So, needless to say, I'm doing my best to bring all of you new content. Simply, I just wanted to say thank you for being so patient with me while all of this is still in production. Some of you may be wondering what video is planned next. I'll go ahead and tell you. It is in fact the Stormtrooper. However, I didn't want to make just a plain white Stormtrooper helmet, so instead I'm either going to paint it up as an artillery Stormtrooper or as the incinerator variant. For anyone that wants to weigh in on this topic, let me know in the comments section which one I should paint and I'll do it. Also, if there's a certain helmet that someone wants to see me put together, it will be considered, so be sure to share your creative input with me as I may pursue just that. Finally, I wanted to give one more huge thank you to all of you for helping me reach and surpass my 300 subscriber milestone. The long-term growth and success of this channel are very important to me, so notably, you all have my undying appreciation. To kick things off, I started by processing the parts that were to be painted up with metallic silver. Every small part was sanded with 80 grit sandpaper and then sprayed down with Rust-Oleum Sandable filler primer. Once the primer had an opportunity to dry, it was back to sanding but with a higher grit sandpaper, 320 grit. Every time the parts were sprayed, layer lines and deep scratches were revealed. The final grade of sandpaper that was used was 600 grit sandpaper. After sanding at this stage, most imperfections really weren't visible, which meant that it was time to move on to metallics. Since I was having to paint in such a small capacity, I decided to airbrush these parts rather than spray paint them. And if I may take a moment to critique myself, I would have had a much easier time painting these parts if I had secured them down and then sprayed them. Either way, I followed up with a high gloss clear coat, specifically this one. This helmet, like others that I have put together, was broken up into multiple parts and required assembly. In order to begin this process, I first sanded the adjoining ends with 80 grit sandpaper and then tacked them together with gel superglue. If you want to speed up the cure time, be sure to have a bottle of superglue accelerator on hand. Once the glue had plenty of time to set, I broke out the plastic welding gun and hot stapled along the seams, increasing the structural integrity between the adjoining ends. The plastic welder is a tool that I first saw in a car bumper cover repair video. I figured that if it's good enough for a plastic bumper cover, it's probably good enough for holding together a 3D print. This process was then repeated for the back side of the dome as well. 80 grit sandpaper is a great choice as it creates deep scratches that the superglue is able to really sink down into and grip well. Also, it's obvious but still important to note that after the dome was completely assembled, I took the time to grind down the remaining ends of the hot staples with a rotary tool. In this case, I used a Dremel, however a die grinder would have worked just as well. Just be sure that you don't miss any unless you enjoy the sensation of sharp metal objects piercing the soft tissue covering your skull. To make things easier on the eyes, I sprayed down the helmet with matte black spray paint before marking the spots on the top of the dome where 4 spikes will be screwed into place. If I remember correctly, these were 1.5 inch wood screws, so nothing special. I will admit that I had to widen the already existing holes at the bottom of the spikes in order for the screws to fit. In doing so, I incidentally drilled through the model 4 times in a row. Ultimately, this led to a respray of all 4 spikes. So, I advise that you acquire the correct hardware before attempting assembly. So far, I feel like I've been doing a fantastic job of showing all of you what mistakes you could potentially make and how to avoid them. Personally, I would have waited to add any metallic parts until after all of the layers of leather were applied. Afterwards, all I would have had to do was cut away areas where the metallic parts needed to be epoxied. It's not to say that because I didn't do it that way that I was wrong, because I was still able to complete this project. By the end of the video, I end up with a pretty sweet looking prop. What I am saying is that by waiting, I could have made the leather wrapping sequence much easier, as there would have been less obstacles on the front of the helmet to work around. Also, I say leather, but for the first 2 layers of the upholstery fabrics that I used, they're actually synthetic leather. In order to install the second fabric, I used a light-duty staple gun, and began applying fabric at the bottom, working my way around the entire mouth section. Note that these staples are respectively at the center of every fold, where the likelihood of being seen is very slim. The width of the fabric was roughly about 4 inches, while the length was never actually determined. The first strip that I used wasn't long enough, so I ended up having to blend a second strip of fabric in order to fully cover it up. Then I was tasked with adding some 2-inch wide leather strips. Unlike the first 2 fabrics, these were actual leather. I found these at Joann Fabrics, and I have shared links in the video description where they can be purchased online. The first strip was applied at an angle, while the only thing holding the nose piece in place was tension from the leather strip. Then another strip was applied at the bottom of the mouth, slightly overlapping the ends of the first section. Also, here's some additional helpful advice. Make sure that when you are applying the leather, that you've anchored down one side of the strip with a couple of staples, and that you pull the fabric tightly while stapling the opposing end. Then use a razor blade or an X-Acto knife to cut away the excess material. For every layer of fabric, I also wanted to provide a close-up of the helmet at a speed that's a little bit easier to follow. So, moving forward, the anchor point for the next 3 layers will be located slightly at the bottom of the helmet on the inside. As we move on to the additional layers, you may also notice that it became increasingly difficult for me to fit leather in between the metallic parts and the main helmet. Certainly this adds emphasis onto what I was suggesting earlier about waiting to epoxy the metallic parts. The process is far less complicated if you do it that way, I assure you. For the next layer, I went with a lighter shade of brown, which I think kind of breaks up the monotony of the dark brown that came before it. And as a reminder, the anchor points for this layer were generally in the same area as the last. Also, like before, here's another close-up of my helmet for the viewers attempting to make their own Tusken Raider helmet. If you're trying to be somewhat accurate with this model, here's another example of what not to do. The tongue-shaped piece that I just applied should have been much longer. For reference, here's a 1977 Tusken Raider from A New Hope. As you can see, that piece comes out much farther. So, be sure not to make this mistake. Finally, I felt like the mouthpiece needed a backing on the inside, so the same black leather from earlier was used. Moving forward, keep in mind that this helmet is only going to be a display piece. If I ever want to put together a full cosplay, I may change it out for some kind of black mesh material because I could imagine it getting pretty hot inside this helmet. At that point, the most important thing to focus on is breathability, and using mesh certainly would allow for more airflow. Tusken Raider helmets typically appear to be wrapped in what seems like very stained and fraying canvas-like material, so for this I purchased about a yard of canvas and tore them respectively into 1.5 or less wide strips, and then began boiling water in a large stainless steel cooking pot with 2 individual 1-gallon tea bags. The idea here is to make the canvas yellow up a little bit before spraying them down unevenly with some coffee for additional staining. To do that, all you'll need to find is an empty spray bottle that's most likely hanging out underneath of your kitchen sink. And finally coming up is unequivocally my favorite part of this video. I hope you all enjoy! Alright, so that's the kind of random stuff that pops into my head during the day. But moving forward, I wanted the binoculars to have tinted lenses in them because of something about Tatooine being a desert-stricken planet with very little water and 2 suns. It just kind of made sense. With 2 suns, you would think that anyone on the livable surface of the planet would be constantly wearing some sort of ocular protection. The tinted material was leftover scraps from one of my previous Mandalorian helmet builds. However, you don't have to necessarily use tinted lenses. I've seen plenty of builds that use black mesh instead, and they come out looking great. The idea behind how I approached wrapping this helmet was similar to how I tackled the leather strips from earlier, anchoring down one end of the fabric and then pulling it somewhat snug over to the adjacent side, all while making sure that the wrappings looked interwoven and somewhat random, while really not leaving a lot of loose ends at the bottom. Once this was done, an additional strip of canvas was glued to the inside of the helmet along the edge of the opening, giving the area a much cleaner look. For your benefit, here's a closer look at that. The way that I weathered this helmet is pretty simple, as I used the following colors in the order listed from top to bottom. I primarily focused on somewhat gunking up the frayed edges of the canvas while also leaving behind random splotches of paint. I also made it a point to get in between and under folds and to darken up recessed areas. One final thing that you'll notice is in the next clip, the black leather is much glossier. Well, I painted over it with an oil-based gloss black paint pen just to shine it up a little. And that, my friends, is it for this video. So if you want to go drop a like, subscribe, or provide your wonderful and very much valued creative input, feel free to do so. I hope that you'll join me next time, and as always, thank you for watching.